to the stage. Sriram's written a book entitled Amrut, which is the story of how India created the first successful single malt and its sort of global success. And talking to him is Desmond Nazareth, who is himself an entrepreneur and has a distillery called Agave India, where he uses indigenous ingredients and methods to produce award-winning liquors. So please welcome Desmond and Sriram. Gentlemen, I hand it over to you.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you to the organizers for allowing us to talk about booze. And we know that Khushwant Singh had his particular favorite alcohol, which was whiskey. And today, oh, sorry.
Those of you who want to have conversations, will you please move to the side? You're absolutely entitled to conversations, but we really would like to hear what they have to say to us, so please settle down. Thank you.
Should we give it some more time? Yeah. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about single malts, and in particular, Amrut, which was India's first single malt. And Sriram Devatha has done a wonderful job writing this book about the backstory to the emergence of India's single malt, first single malt, which has then become the playbook for a whole lot of other companies, including one local company, Solan, which is producing single malts. So before getting into anything, Sriram, I want to first congratulate you on writing a book about a topic that has really been written about in the world of spirits. The only other books that I could find, and almost all of them I've read because I am myself a craft distiller, are a 2010 book called Every Bastard Says No. It concerns, the struggle of a small company to build a brand in a world which is filled with the big alcohol brands. In 2013, there was a book called The Patron Way, which is the inside story of the world's most famous tequila. In 2016, there was a book called Inside the Bottle, People, Brands, and Stories, which was written by the ex-Seagram marketing honcho, Arthur Shapiro. And then in 2022, a book called This Shit Will Never Sell, the story of men who sold the world what it didn't know it wanted. And now comes Sriram's book, which is The Great Churn, the global story of India's first single malt, Amrut. Your book covers a lot of topics. It covers Amrut's branding strategies. It covers alcohol regulations in India, the dynamics of a family business, the bias against Indian single malts when they first came out, both in India and abroad, the economic imperative of premiumization, and then finally the science and creativity of producing a world-class spirit in India. So let's start at the beginning, just so that we place things in context. Tell us, how did you get involved with the writing of a book, other than your taste for single malts, maybe?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that expansive introduction. My title pales in comparison to the other colorful titles that he read out. But I mean, that's the first question, right? How do you find a story, right? As someone who's a storyteller, right? I think at some level, the story also found me. I was very lucky. I had written a previous book of short stories. 2 years ago, I didn't know I would write about whiskey. I'm no whiskey expert. We just drank like everyone else to get a high and have a good time. And you didn't know there was that much business and craft behind it. So I luckily met someone who was working with Amrut, and I chased them down. And in a typical South Bangalore way, they said, what's the big deal about this story, right? Why we don't want to tell it? There's no big deal. And I told them, fair, you don't want to do it for the PR, but do it at least to inspire, because surely we need a lot of stories, especially for the entrepreneurs, because everything is a big element of entrepreneurship today, right? So, and that's when they finally agreed after 6 months of persuading, and they didn't even commit until I gave them the manuscript. So I spent a year writing the first draft, rewriting it, editing it, showed them that, and then they were like, okay, this looks good, let's do this, right? So that's my entry. So I'm a storyteller primarily, and I've approached that in a storytelling format. One of the biggest challenges is to make tough topics like distillation and organic chemistry exciting, right? That's a challenge as a teacher as well. So I've tried to do this in a very accessible format to inspire and hopefully even learn, apart from getting that good high, what goes into making a brand. That's my 2 cents about this.
You've done an excellent job for being a non-alcohol person in terms of researching the technical aspects of it, and you've managed to convey the technical aspects with a light touch, which I give a lot of credit to as being a technical person myself. Now, one of the things that I find amazing about stories in these books that I talked about, as well as in Sriram's book, is that aha moment when an idea strikes out of the blue, out of some kind of context that you've built up over the period of months or years. In this case, the idea probably came to certain people in your story. And can you tell us about the aha moments, at least a couple of them, where something clicks and then works?
Okay. So just to be clear, the book covers the latest innovation of the company, right? The distillery is 75 years old. They started in 48. They're a family firm. The 3rd generation of the family runs it. And they started off by doing contract rum for the armed services. That was the scale that they had. That was their first thing. But the genius, and I think, so that was the founder, Mr. Radhakrishna Jagdale. Then his son comes in the 70s, and he realizes that we need to play in the premiumization ladder, right? Many brands, a lot of good companies in India are good at selling mass stuff, right? Historically also, we've always been known for generic goods, pepper, cotton. We've never branded it. That's a Western innovation that we had to learn. One of the key things that sort of struck me is how in the early 2000s, Mr. Neelkant Rao Jagdale, the son, the 2nd generation, saw that there's value in going up the chain, right? That means investing and learning, because there were very few sort of technical know-how or product understanding of how to make a single malt. And they started off in the true Bangalore spirit of a startup, right? This is in the early 2000s, and we only look at the new age startups, but they started by actually pouring the barley in manually to understand how it's done. So the technicians that were hired were college graduates, not with fancy training, but they learned on the job, and they learned by actually experimenting, throwing batches and batches away, realizing that it's not working, and then finally going in and investing and getting that pot still, right? So that, I think, is the first approach itself. That's one. Second, from a brand perspective, right? All companies struggle with this. What do we stand for? What is our brand positioning? One of the things that struck me as I spoke to people and wrote the story is that they were completely sure that they want to be called Indian single malt, right? There is no Indian Scotch. Scotch is like champagne, right? Whatever comes out of Scotland is Scotch. There is no way that you can call an Indian whiskey Scotch, right? So that's the first misnomer. So they were very, very clear from the beginning. And there's an image of the first product iteration, and it is completely Indian, right? You can see the way they've named it, Amrut. You'll see the photo of the Himalayas as a logo. So that really struck me as to how there was so much clarity in terms of what the company or the brand is supposed to embody, right? As they did that, and another thing that they realized, in the early 2000s, the Indian market was very, very shallow. We didn't have that many people who had the buying appetite for a premium single malt. So one of the things that they boldly took was that we will take, like carrying coal to Newcastle, they said we will convince the Scots that this is a super whiskey, and then we will come back. This has a lot of nuances or layers to it, but they were so clear that they have to convince the UK drinker that this is good whiskey. And ironically, it was the Indian origin people there who didn't want to give this a chance, because no one, precedent-wise, right? They just didn't expect something good to come out of here. It was those initial whiskey influencers who had a big role in pushing the brand ahead, right? For example, Jim Murray, who's a whiskey expert. Amrit started having what I say is the good problem. They couldn't sell in the beginning, but then Jim Murray put them on the third in the world whiskey Bible, and everyone went crazy. Everyone's like, we want this. Where is this available? And there were queues, and they had to struggle to meet that demand. So that also was an important milestone, right? And moving ahead,
Talk about the aha moments.
yeah, I'm coming to that. So the next thing was a classic entrant to the market, right? How do you gain market share when there are already established brands and they have crazy marketing budgets, right? Amrit, initial strategy was to mimic what Cobra and Kingfisher did very successfully. Kingfisher and Cobra offered this very crisp lager, and they realized that there are thousands of curry houses in the UK. So good hit of chicken tikka masala and a crispy lager worked really well. That's what Cobra and Kingfisher did. So the approach initially was that it will be based on that same approach. Try to sell Indian whiskey to Indian restaurants in the UK. But the way you pair whiskey with food is not how you pair lager. So they had to do that so many times to understand that it doesn't work. And that's when they had to give that up and try to target the average retail buyer, right? And that's when they started doing what the Coke and the Pepsi, classic case, right? Coke had the market share in the 70s, the cola was, and Pepsi was trying to gain market share, and how do you do that? So one of the things that Pepsi did very smartly was a blind tasting. They said, you're going to be too biased based on the product, let's take the brand out of the mix. And they made people drink a sample A, which was probably Coke, and B was Pepsi. And guess what people said? What they liked more? Pepsi is what they said, and that's when the market share took off. And that's one of the things that Amrit did repeatedly to win those initial followers, right? So I'll stop there. So maybe.
Yeah. So I'm especially interested in the moment which Neelakanta Rao Jagdale sort of was trying to figure out why his single malt that he had made before and a peated version of the same weren't really selling as much. And then something occurred to him that you've written about.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I missed that, right?
Yeah.
So one of the pivotal moments was the launch of Amrit Fusion, which is sitting right here. And it actually came down to a business problem. Amrit was selling a lot of their single malt, their peated, but they had a lot of stocks of their single malt, right, which didn't have the peat flavor for whatever reason. That's how it was working. So he had to solve the oversupply of one expression with the deficiency of the other. But the market had a taste for peated. That's when he blended both of them. In a way, it's a blend of India and Scotland because peat is not available here. It's an organic material that you use to heat up whiskey. So the marrying of the peated and the non-peated is this iconic expression that most people who know Amrit would have first consumed this, right? And that was conceptualized in a very similar setting. I can't help but think Ooty is very, very similar to the hills of Kasauli. I can't help because I was there recently and I was like, wow, this is just so similar. If you, you took away the landmarks and you just clicked a generic image, it looks very similar. So it was conceptualized in a very similar sort of an ambience, right? So that was the whiskey that eventually became it was rated the third best by Jim Murray, and that's when Amrit started having the good problem, like I'm saying.
So, to my recollection, reading the book, he found out that there was a blend of these two spirits that he had made that were not selling as well, which was Fusion, which he then developed with his master distiller, and that this became the vehicle that took Amrit to the skies, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, this is the whiskey that Jim Murray wrote about, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So let's go to there are three generations involved in this family story. The grandfather who, Radhakrishna Rao Jagdale, and then Neelakanta Rao Jagdale, and now currently Rakshit Jagdale. This sounds like a Jagdale story, but actually when you read the book, you find something far more interesting, that there is a gentleman by the name of Ashok Chokalingam, who plays a critical role in what happened with Amrut and its success. Could you tell us a little bit about Ashok Chokalingam and why he gets so much mileage in the book?
Yeah, okay. So this I must credit the brand, to Mr. Rakshit especially. How many business books do you read where it covers more people than the protagonist or the founder or the promoter? It's very hard for a promoter to let it go, right? So they were I was very lucky. I don't know if I'll ever get another chance because I got complete leeway in the way I wrote it. Barring the factual corrections, there was literally nothing that the brand touched. So that is from the company's perspective, they were magnanimous. Ashok Chokalingam is the one who is the head distiller. He has a critical part in pricing, deciding which expression comes in. The entire vertical rests with him, and the company trusts him so much that they let him do all the big decisions there. But there are also other people, right? And I've written about them as well. So that, I think, goes a lot about the brand. Now, coming to
Ashok.
Ashok, right?
Already start.
Yeah, so
Already start.
the other reason I chose Ashok Chokalingam is, it's a no-brainer, right? If you're a good storyteller, we all love a rags to riches. We all love an underdog, right? It's no-brainer that, let me contrast it, right? Mr. Rakshit, who's third generation, Bangalore born in a very important family in Bengaluru, versus Mr. Ashok Chokalingam, who comes from Mayavaram, which is a small town in Tamil Nadu. And he had to work his way up. The way he had, even English was a challenge for him, right? And the fact that he was able to do that, and he comes from an engineering background. He didn't know anything about distilling. So that is definitely also compelling storytelling for me. The character was rich, complex, right? So it made sense for Ashok to take a lot more of the space, and the brand was very, very kind to accommodate that. So that's I don't know, I find him one of the most secure founders. It's very hard to let go, right, in that sense.
Yeah, it's fascinating because he actually started out as a sales guy, international sales for Amrut in London, and was facing all kinds of difficulties with the skepticism that Indian restaurants and other establishments were expressing about this liquid that Amrut was putting out there. And then at some point, there is a change that happens. Can you talk about that change and how, I mean, what I'd like to say is that this trajectory from being a sales guy to being the head distiller itself is quite fascinating. But tell us about what changed, what were the missteps that were recognized and then corrected?
Okay, so you are sitting out of Bangalore. Imagine this. This is the problem statement, right? You're sitting out of India, and you're trying to sell whiskey to the Scots or the UK market, right? And there is only one employee because you're not funded with millions of PE. You're running it on family resources. And you have the one person sitting there, Mr. Ashok, in UK, trying to make this happen. Now, obvious wisdom, right? Common sense will tell you that Mr. Ashok is probably in the best place to tell you what is sticking and what is not, right? What is working? Which barrel is working? Which expression is working? What are the other brands doing? How do people market? What is the UK way of doing it? What are the offers, right? So one way to look at it is that it's common sense that Mr. Ashok had to take over the product development as well. But in classic corporates, you are restricted to one job. You do one thing. Your mandate is one. You either sales, you either marketing, you're doing one thing. It's a core competency, you stick to that. How many companies will have the sort of wisdom to say, no, you seem to understand this well, recognizing the potential and say, from sales, you can shift over into the completely, from people skills, which is marketing and sales. You need to talk to people, you need to convince them, to dealing with organic compounds, sitting in a distillery, working out what will work well, where do you source your barrels from, which is logistics. That's the unique thing about Mr. Ashok and Amrut, because if you look around in other distillers, I think there are only 2 such whiskey brands that have done something like this, where the sales guy ended up becoming the head distiller. So that is one part, right? Mr. Ashok also had to undergo severe retraining, right? Distilling, understanding those temperature controls is not easy. So he ended up taking some courses and he learned on the job, which is, I think, again, very incredible now that I think about it. Most of the people who have, or top management there, have joined there, stayed there for decades and learned on the job. They're not the, high-flying management graduates that we see who are just, come in there to, strike off a wand. So it's very refreshingly, I don't know if it's nostalgia, but there is a sense of that familial values seeping in terms of trust and all that, right? So.
So that's, there is a similar journey in my company, which I'll talk about another day, perhaps with your help. One of the things that struck me about the way you've chosen to write this book is that you recreate conversations and atmosphere. You talk about, say, the light filtering through the curtains here and the greenery there and so on. So did you actually visit all these locations? Are you depending on third party, like, your interviewees' memories of what was going on? To what extent did you use poetic license in this? I was struck by the details. You would talk about a smell or a taste or a sight.
See, that's always a tough one, and I have taken. It's a complex problem, right? There is some amount of art in it. There's also the craft as well as the serious facts of it, right? Mr. NRJ wasn't unfortunately alive when I started this, right? He was a pivotal character in the whole story, right? So how do I recreate that? Sure, I can visit the farmhouse that he had in Ooty and understand, the sort of environment there that I did. But what I also had to rely on was the correlation across. I triangulated. I interviewed multiple people, right? I spoke to folks from UK, Canada, Sweden, obviously the top management of Amrut. I also did some secondary research, right? So there's a whole bunch of things you do to triangulate as an author. And the one thing that kept coming back across people about when you ask them about NRJ, that's the one I've tried to sort of isolate and write about to some level of, with some level of creativity. You can't just present it in the normal way, right? So there is a lot of the science in it, but there is also the art of saying, okay, this is a man, this is the context, it's 90s Bangalore or early 2000s Bangalore, what would they be like, right? So there is a lot of that filling of the gaps as an author, and I've taken that creative liberty, but it's built on this solid correlation that has happened across interviews that I did, right? So that's how I had to resolve that.
I suspect you were working on a screenplay, because that's how screenplays are written. You do the location setting, the atmosphere, and then you have the conversation taking place. Is there a film in the making? You don't have to answer that.
Yeah, let's just say you've sort of put your hand on the right thing I was attempting here.
So one of the key players in the Jagdale story is Nilakanta Rao Jagdale, and he passed away by the time you started working on this. So how did you manage to sort of get what he said and what he thought and so on and so forth? Is it through his son or Ashok or a bunch of other characters? Who are some of the other supporting characters who would have given you that kind of detail that you could then translate into conversations involving the NRJ who had passed away?
So yes, right. A big part of it came from the son and the son-in-law who run it. But there is also two employees who have worked there for 40 years. Can you imagine just starting your career and almost close to retiring in the same? I don't know. It's very quaint for Bangalore standards. I'm thinking it's quaint for in any employing standards. Very few people stay like that. And they have seen some employees. Mr. Lakshmanan has seen even Mr. Radhakrishna Jagdale. So I got the transition of not just Mr. Nilakanta Rao Jagdale, but Mr. Radhakrishna Jagdale as well in some of those bits. Right? So yes, in a way, that's the way I went about filling those.
So it's a great, I'd say, product because of all these reconstructions that take place, because you don't feel that he's reconstructing. You feel that he's actually telling the story as NRJ would have told it. Now, in any such endeavor which is entrepreneurial or intrapreneurial, as in this case, because the word intrapreneurial is not used very much, but here's a big company making a whole bunch of IMFL, which is Indian-made foreign liquor, and then setting aside some of their profits to develop an entirely new and provoking product, the first Indian single malt. In the course of such a journey, there are many points at which you feel like all hope is lost. There are critical junctures when giving up seems like the only thing to do, and yet the story went on. Can you talk about a couple of such junctures? Because I know I have had several such junctures in my own story.
Okay, so the first challenge was, right, so Amrut, since it had, was trying to sell in the UK, it had only one expression in the single malt. That was the only one, and I think they launched another one with it, maybe a couple of expressions. So they tried to put that out and started talking to retailers, and they're like, this will not work. You need more expressions. The market will not look at you seriously unless you have 3 expressions at least, right? So that itself took them so long to sort of convince and invest and develop those 3-4 products that they had to do. That was the first thing. The second thing was, initially, Mr. Ashok, like I said, was only doing sales, right? And the company structure, they were working with a lot of part-time consultants from the UK who they knew. And it just wasn't working because the skills were not matching. So the losses kept mounting, and they were like, okay, I think this is not going to work. This was a little on the verge of shutting shop. And an interesting thing happens in Tavistock, which is a park in the UK, and it has a Gandhi bus there, and they sit there and they're having this conversation, and Mr. NRJ is going through it again, like that, over and over again. What is wrong? Why is it not working? What should we change? Is it the branding? Is it the packaging? 100,000 questions, right, when something doesn't work. You don't know exactly why. And they're on the verge of saying, let's just shut it, because we've lost what we've lost. We are a family-run firm. We're plowing our profits. We're not borrowing it on debt or equity. So let's just shut it. And For some strange reason, Mr. NRJ is like, let's do it, let's give it one more push, and he overhauls the entire thing, and that's when he puts Mr. Ashok as in charge for the thing, and then there's no looking back after that, because a whole lot of work starts happening and aligning after that, right? Again, very classic case of who you need to empower and who you need to sort of cut out in management. So those were some of the things that were really, really challenging for them. The third thing is selling to the restaurants, right? It's not working. There's one instance where he visits a Punjabi restaurant and the elderly Sikh man is like, yeah, who will buy this? Come and have lunch, right? And he's struggling. He's not had a meal. He's going from rejection to rejection, and the nice Sardarji says, come have a meal. It's okay, don't worry. He also struggled because he also migrated to the UK and he built himself up, right? So there are lots of these touching moments where out of the blue, people will be like, okay, give me, and he feeds him, he says no, then he picks up 2 bottles just so that he, sort of helps him in that way. So there are lots of these nice people moments that, propel the brand as the brand moves on.
I like the fact that one of the aha moments happens in a park that has a Gandhi statue, because as we all know, Gandhi liked his whiskey.
Yeah, that is a paradox, that's true. You caught that.
Yeah. So, I see that in the story there's a critical moment that happens where this Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible endorsement happens. In your opinion, how important is that? And it connects up to something that I feel rather ashamed to say, that in India with my brand, which tries to make agave, which is normally made in Mexico, the whole idea of Indian agave was very tough to convince people that this is something worthwhile that we're making here at international standards. So we have not got endorsements of the kind that Jim Murray gave Amrut. In your opinion, how important was this endorsement, and does it address the issue of Indian customers need to get endorsement from the West?
Yeah, I think this was absolutely critical. Like I said, until then they were struggling, right? Because how does someone discover a good book, right? You need a recommendation. You read a critical column of an expert, and that's when you trust it, right? Not everyone's going to be able to look at every single whiskey, right? So it was very, very critical that it was listed. And firstly, it was unknown. What is also very interesting about when I put this book out is like very few people even know they know Amrut exists, but they don't know anything about the company. So the scarcity itself has its novelty, right? The moment Jim Murray put it, like, which whiskey is this? Where does, India makes whiskey. So that's an expression that I heard across people from Sweden to Canada. They're like, we thought India makes scotch. They say the same thing that we do. And they had to keep saying, no, we make Indian single malt. We can't call ourselves scotch, right? So it was very, very critical that someone who was a, evangelist or an influencer to put this out. And that's how it took off. And ironically, our people weren't willing to give it a chance, although it's come full circle now, because it's interesting. Amrut Fusion outsells the entire scotch in the country. I think they sell about 500,000 cases annually, right? Any party that I've gone, I have largely seen this now. So in a way, it is also the India story with, I think Amitabh sir right here. So there is that India story, cherry on the cake, that has come back, in that sense, right? So initially there was skepticism, but that thing did change it.
Since Amitabh is here, we will talk now, switch to the subject of the hypocrisy of Indian governments with respect to alcohol. There's a certain love-hate relationship that one senses that's really tough to deal with as an alcohol manufacturer, somebody trying something new. We are all sort of cast in the same mold. Innovation is not recognized. So can you talk a little bit about what you discovered regarding the hypocrisy of Indian governments with respect to alcohol and how this love-hate relationship works?
Okay, let me give you a scary statistic, right? In 2018, according to an RBI report, the entire tax collected on alcohol, excise, and across the country was about 1.51 trillion rupees. Any guesses how much the army's budget is for that same year? 1.55 trillion, right? So all the tax you collect on booze can fund the second largest standing army in terms of budget, right? So that is a macro view of it. I come from Karnataka, Bengaluru. So the Karnataka government cannot afford a prohibition. 21% of their revenue comes from there. They probably can cover all the salaries of their employees with just their excise tax. Do you think there'll be a prohibition there? So there is this inherent contradiction between actually running the governance versus, prohibition, the Gandhian temperance that he was talking about, right? So, in fact, I won't quote the name, but one of the quotes that came up was like, there's this prominent alcohol brewer. He was like, my product everybody wants. Whether people are sad or people are happy, they want a sip of my product. The governments love me because they can tax the hell out of me. But nobody wants to touch us. No one wants to do anything pro us. We don't get any GST input benefits, any of that, right? So it's actually very, very troubling, that whole relationship that we have. And if you trace back culturally, right, that's also something I've broadly touched. If you look at Arthashastra, there is a strong indication of regulation and taxation. Chanakya very clearly, Kautilya clearly says that it has to be regulated, taxed, restricted, right? Even if you go back even further in the Vedas, they say it was restricted based on the caste you were from. Certain people couldn't touch it, right? So there has always been this moderation, largely, I would say, from my research, that we always said regulate it. Don't be completely banning it. Don't be completely, just let it loose in that sense.
Okay, cool. One of the things that I learned from this book, and I learned a hell of a lot because I knew about Amrit, how it started as a kind of regular IMFL company selling mainly to defense sector and so on, was the amount of continuous improvement and innovation they were doing behind the scenes. But most Indians didn't get to experience this innovation and improvement because these expressions, I mean, they made something called spectrum, wherein I think Ashok was the person who decided to create a cask which had staves of different kinds of woods with different kinds of, to give the liquid greater complexity and greater flavor. So they had an edition called Spectrum that I don't think we saw in India. They did something with malted rye, which again, we didn't see in India. And they worked with other single grains. They've done triple distilled. All these are expressions that were sold abroad. They were limited editions. So they followed a certain, they did small quantities of very premium limited editions. Then they also did like medium quantities of expressions that sold medium, not super innovative, but something more mainstream. And then, of course, they had the Fusion, which was the popular brand, which now outsells everything else, as you were pointing out. Now, I learned all this stuff only through reading your book. So I suggest you read this book if you're interested in whiskey and how it developed in India, and also the playbook that you will recognize that's being followed by so many other companies. We can go on and on, but I'd like to ask for audience participation, asking questions, because at the end of this, we have a little bit of a surprise with the tribute that I plan to pay. Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay, fine. Sure. Yeah, 5 minutes for questions and then 5 minutes for the surprise tribute.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Last night we had dinner together.
Yes.
And I have served at various levels in various departments of Punjab. I have been at DTC distilleries also, and this gentleman has written a book. I have a few questions. You see, I'm an ex-army captain.
Could you restrict yourself to one question, please, because there may be others.
Just 2-3 questions. Very relevant to...
I'm already nervous, sir. You know much more than it probably I do.
No. My question is this relates to the economy of Punjab.
Okay.
Economy of Punjab. The present day, the last year 23-24, the GST collection was 20,000 crores. And from excise, it was just 9,000 crores. Very little. Peanuts. Now,
Your question, sir.
yes, sir, I'm coming to that. 3 Chief Minister of Delhi, Mr. Kejriwal, Sindra Jain, and Manish Jain, Sindra Jain, Manish Jain, Sisodia, they were behind bars for these kickbacks. Kindly, sir, listen to.
There's very
What is
little-
the
we
what
have
is the
5
role?
minutes. Can you not take
Yes.
all of them?
Yeah. What is the role of the distillers? Because they return the kickbacks as per the policy. 12% is being cut from the wholesalers and 6% is being given back to these senior officers, these politicians.
What's your question, sir?
What is the role? How do you approve of this?
We are not sitting in judgment of all the practices that go on in India. I think he's an author. I'm a craft distiller. I don't believe in corruption. But yes, there's a lot of corruption in the industry, granted. And when there's such corruption uncovered, the guilty should be punished.
You saved me the trouble, Desmond. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, sorry. Madam.
The question is to you. I'm Anu.
Hi, ma'am.
I really do not know whether you drink. Do you drink? Good. So I think that people who own these companies should drink, and that's why there was a fall with the Mohan Meakin breweries, because Mr. Kapil Mohan did not drink.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting.
Okay, he didn't touch drinks. So what do you feel the Solon black gold, which is in the market, is it as good as this, or is it better, or you are better?
Wow, okay.
Okay,
So I'm
sorry.
all tough questions. I'll try to answer it the way I think. So when I did the research, I found, I don't know if this is too nerdy, but I will do it. I did a lot of secondary research, right? And one test that they did was they put tasters in a room that was fully wood paneled. And they made them sip it and they asked them the notes. They said woody notes. And suddenly you replace it with grass, they say there's a lot of vegetal notes, right? So, and there are some studies that I read that genetics decide your flavor palette, right? To each to their own is the net summary that I'm coming to, right? But what I will say is the innovation of Amrit, which I wish I'd spoken, was the way they have branded themselves. They have used Sangam literature in terms of how their expressions are named. A funny joke Mr. Ashok loves to recall is, I'm from Tamil Nadu, man. I can't say Loch Lomond like how the Scots say it. I'm going to make them say Naidil like how the Tamilians say it, right? So there was some of these, very interesting storytelling bits that they did with the brand, which I found very, very interesting in that sense.
Okay, so I think we're done with the 5 minutes, yeah? So the special tribute is something that I think only I can pay, and I asked for collaboration of fusion alcohol with my Mahua liqueur to produce a cocktail on stage, which a few lucky people will get in small quantities to taste. Could you put that picture up there, because that actually allows me to pay the tribute. I'd like to pay this tribute to Neelakanta Rao Jagdale, the creator of Amrit Fusion. It's something that I discovered along the way when I tried to see, oh, there it is. Yeah, in 2018, none other than Neelakanta Rao presented me with an award for the product debut of the year when I put out Mahua and Mahua liqueur. Mahua liqueur is on a Mahua base, which has honey and spices in it. And now I have figured out that there's a lovely, simple cocktail of these two liquids that we are going to make right now, and about 30 lucky people will get to taste this, and it'll be our tribute to him together. He passed away less than 6 months, or maybe less than a year for sure, after he gave me this award. So we are going to do this now, and if you don't mind, where's the bartender who's going to help with the pouring? You can volunteer, yeah. इसमें डालो आधा बॉटल
Thank you. So I'll just say one other thing. I missed this, but as they're pouring this, one of the interesting things also about Amrit is how the Beijing Indian Embassy poured this out as an outreach to the Chinese. So there is some element of diplomacy that the whole category and Amrit is also sort of doing, right? One of my drivers was that, can we look beyond yoga and Bollywood and find more soft power elements that we can build for the country as a narrative, right? So I hope you like this.
So what this cocktail generates is something like a drambuie, if you've tasted that. Because what we have here, drambuie has a whiskey base, and it has honey, spices, and some herbs on it. So what we have here is Amrut's fusion with mahua, which slides under the whiskey, and which has my mahua liqueur, which has honey and spices, Indian spices in it. एक मिनट नहीं इसको आधा दो सबको 50-50 ml दोगे रफली है 30 ग्लास से ज़्यादा भी बनाओ like a good bartender it's अंदाज से yeah half and half हो गया awesome cheers man No, I think anybody who's interested in tasting, please just join a small queue here.
My question, please, sir, please. So many.
What did you want me to taste? This is the one you want me to taste.
Desmond, you had promised कि आगे बैठो तो मिलेगा ना.
Sitting. Well, thank you so much.
So with that wonderful surprise, we're bringing the morning sessions to a close. Thank you again to our presenting partners, VNR, for allowing us to have this wonderful fest.
Mr.
Those of
Jagdale
you
gets the cheers.
who are not going to try the mix, please go ahead for lunch. Please be back by 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, please.